So a headline that really caught my eye recently, it was about the Trump administration's reported role in brokering an India-Pakistan ceasefire,
Yeah.
which, given the usual rhetoric and the complex history there, it definitely wasn't something I was expecting to see.
No, it's a development that certainly raises eyebrows, especially for those of us who follow that intricate, often really tense relationship between India and Pakistan.
Right.
The idea of the U.S. actively jumping in to de-escalate things feels, well, a bit out of sync with some of the earlier signals we get from Washington, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And for you listening, especially if you're tracking global events for, say, the UPSC exams, or you just have a keen interest in staying informed this situation, it gives a really insightful look into potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy and also the security dynamics of a really critical geopolitical region. We're diving deep into a detailed report from the Indian Express today to try and get a clearer picture.
And our aim here is really to unpack this reported U.S. involvement. What were the driving forces? What might have led to this? And maybe what it could mean for future stability, for U.S. policy there.
Yeah.
And it's really crucial to remember, as the Indian Express itself highlights, that India has denied any U.S. role in brokering the ceasefire. So that adds another layer of complexity to what we're trying to understand.
Okay, right. So let's start maybe by looking at those initial signs, the ones that suggested the U.S. might actually be, disengaging from this kind of thing. I remember President Trump making a comment, pretty casual, about India and Pakistan, something like, they'll figure it out themselves.
That's right. That didn't exactly signal proactive diplomacy, did it?
No.
The prevailing narrative, at least initially, seemed to point towards a U.S. focus maybe on other global hotspots.
Right.
And perhaps a reluctance to get deeply involved in these long-standing regional disputes. Gaza, Ukraine were very much front and center, and the strategic competition with China remained a top priority. So this created an expectation, I think, that the U.S. might be stepping back a bit from its traditional mediating role in South Asia.
And then you also had Vice President Vance's quite direct statement about not wanting to get involved in a war that wasn't, quote, fundamentally our business. That seemed pretty clear.
Yeah, that seemed like a very clear indicator. The U.S. wasn't about to insert itself into an India-Pakistan crisis.
Right.
Indeed. Those statements, they definitely fostered a perception of U.S. reluctance. Maybe even a departure from past times where the U.S. had a much more visible hand in managing tensions between these two nuclear-armed neighbors, which of course makes these subsequent reports of their involvement all the more noteworthy.
Okay, but then at the same time, we also need to remember there were some very vocal pro-India voices inside the U.S. administration.
True.
Vance, for instance, offered all assistance to India after that Pahalgam attack. He framed it as a joint fight against terrorism. That sounds like pretty strong alignment.
It is strong. And Secretary of State Rubio, well, even before he took that job, he'd put forward a bill arguing for India to get the same allied status as key partners like Japan and Israel.
Wow, okay.
So that really underscored a significant feeling within parts of the U.S. establishment that viewed India as a vital strategic partner in the region.
So we have these seemingly contradictory signals then. Hints of disengagement, but also strong support for India. How do we square that with these reports of the U.S. actively facilitating a ceasefire? It feels like two different things happening at once.
It certainly presents a complex picture, doesn't it? Yeah. But even with those initial signals, the historical precedent suggests the U.S. has often stepped in during moments of crisis between India and Pakistan.
Okay.
As the Indian Express points out, there's actually a well-established history of U.S. diplomatic intervention in past military confrontations. When tensions hit a certain point, the U.S. has frequently gotten involved.
That makes sense. And I suppose the main driver for that continued interest, even if it was maybe understated at first, would be the nuclear dimension, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The U.S. has a fundamental interest in stopping any escalation between two states with nuclear weapons.
Exactly. The risk of miscalculation or unintended escalation between nuclear powers, that's a paramount concern for global security, and the U.S. is acutely aware of that. So regardless of any initial rhetoric about avoiding foreign entanglements, the specter of nuclear conflict would almost certainly prompt a pretty significant response from Washington.
It's also worth thinking about the Trump administration itself. Despite the America First rhetoric, they also seemed quite drawn to the idea of playing the role of global peace broker. It's a bit of a paradox, really.
That's a very astute observation. That desire to broker a deal, to be seen as a successful negotiator, could well have been a motivating factor here, too. And as the Indian Express details, Rubio was reportedly quite active behind the scenes. He was maintaining communication with counterparts in both New Delhi and Islamabad, even before formal talks were really on the table.
So quiet diplomacy happening.
Suggests a level of quiet diplomatic groundwork, yes.
Okay, so the U.S. was engaged in trying to de-escalate, but the jump to actually helping broker a ceasefire, that's still a big step. The Indian Express piece highlights the unexpected intensity of these U.S. efforts. It wasn't just a nudge, it was reportedly a full-on diplomatic surge.
Precisely. Now, the article is careful to clarify there was no concrete evidence suggesting the U.S. was directly involved in the actual ceasefire negotiations between India and Pakistan.
Meaning they weren't at the table.
Correct. They weren't sitting at the table, but the implication is that their intensified diplomatic push created the necessary conditions for those bilateral discussions to even happen. They essentially paved the way.
Okay, so what then were the specific triggers? What likely prompted this more intense U.S. involvement? The Indian Express really emphasizes the dynamics of the military escalation itself. Can you break that down a bit?
Certainly. The level of military force used in this recent crisis was, well, notably higher than in previous standoffs. India's airstrikes were described as the most intense since the 1971 war. That immediately escalated things and raised the potential for serious retaliation. And what's more, the willingness of both sides to send drones and missiles deep into each other's territory, targeting significant military installations. That signaled a definite increase in their risk tolerance.
That paints a picture of things spiraling pretty quickly. The Indian Express even notes this was the closest the two countries had come to war since the Kargil conflict back in '99.
Which was a major clash.
Yeah, and maybe the most serious test of nuclear deterrence since they both went nuclear. That's a deeply concerning thought.
It is. And that stark reality, becoming clearer with each sort of tit-for-tat action, likely compelled Washington to take a much more proactive, much more urgent stance. The potential for a conventional fight to spiral dangerously with that ever-present nuclear threat. That would have been a powerful catalyst for the U.S. to step up its intervention.
And you mentioned the nuclear factor specifically as another key reason for the stepped-up U.S. role. What particular events during this crisis really amplified those nuclear concerns?
Well, two specific things on May 9th seem to have been particularly alarming, according to the reporting. First, India's reported targeting of the Nurkan airbase in Rawalpindi.
Okay.
Now, what makes this so significant is its close proximity to Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division.
Right, the body overseeing their nuclear arsenal.
Exactly. So that action would have sent a very clear and potentially quite destabilizing signal.
Yeah, that sounds like something that could easily be misinterpreted or provoke a much stronger reaction given the sensitivities around nuclear assets. What was the second event?
The second was Pakistan's public announcement that they would be convening a meeting of their National Command Authority.
The body that controls their nuclear policy.
That's the one. Now, while the meeting was reportedly postponed in the end, the very public announcement of it would have undoubtedly set alarm bells ringing loud and clear in Washington. It signaled a heightened state of alert regarding their nuclear posture.
It sounds like both sides were taking actions that were brushing right up against that nuclear threshold.
It appears so.
So it's really no wonder the U.S. would have felt compelled to intervene more decisively then. The Indian Express even references past U.S. interventions during Kargil, the 2001-02 standoff, and again in 2019, according to Pompeo, all driven by similar fears of nuclear escalation.
That historical context is absolutely vital for understanding the U.S. response here. There's a pattern, a well-established one, of Washington stepping in when it perceives a heightened risk of nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan.
So not entirely new ground.
Not entirely novel in that sense, no. But the sheer intensity of the military escalation this time likely amplified those pre-existing concerns significantly.
Okay, so the U.S. wanted a ceasefire, and it seems, according to the reports, they were successful in facilitating one. How did they manage that? Especially given the high levels of mistrust and tension. The Indian Express suggests a few potential leverage points.
Yes, the reporting points to a few key contributing factors. Firstly, the influence that figures like Rubio and Vance actually wielded within the Trump administration. That, coupled with their direct access to the president, would have been significant.
Right.
Their personal engagement, their advocacy for de-escalation, likely carried considerable weight.
And Rubio's dual role at the time Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, that seems like it would give him huge authority and access, right, on both sides.
Exactly. He could engage on multiple diplomatic fronts simultaneously. That dual capacity probably streamlined communication and allowed for a more comprehensive diplomatic effort.
Makes sense.
Secondly, there's President Trump's reported suggestion of using trade as a potential leverage point. He apparently hinted at the possibility of, improved trade talks if de-escalation happened.
And interesting, the article does note that maybe purely commercial factors weren't decisive on their own.
Probably not.
But the prospect of maybe more favorable trade deals could have provided an extra little incentive for both India and Pakistan to think about moving towards a ceasefire.
It's often about creating a sort of confluence of factors, isn't it? Things that align to make de-escalation just more palatable.
Yeah.
And the Indian Express also raises a really insightful point about both India and Pakistan maybe reaching a stage where they felt they could claim some form of strategic success.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, India had conducted those significant airstrikes, including the one near the sensitive Nurkan base. Pakistan, on the other hand, claimed it shot down Indian jets and was able to rally domestic support.
Right, so in a way, both sides had achieved some of their immediate goals, or at least could spin it that way to their home audiences.
Precisely.
That might have made stepping back, de-escalating, less politically costly for them. They could pull back without looking like they'd conceded defeat.
Exactly. The achievement of certain domestic political goals by both governments could well have created a kind of window of opportunity for de-escalation. Once they'd shown a strong response, maybe the political fallout from agreeing to a ceasefire seemed lower than the risks of continuing the fight.
So where do things stand now? The immediate crisis seems to have cooled down, but the Indian Express is careful to caution that the ceasefire is fragile. What's the outlook?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Especially for anyone tracking this region, maybe for UPSC exams covering international relations or just generally. While the immediate danger of large-scale conflict has receded for now, the underlying issues fueling the tensions between India and Pakistan, they haven't gone away. They persist.
Still there.
Still very much there. The Indian Express rightly suggests that future standoffs are certainly possible. And in those scenarios, we might very well see the U.S. playing a similar kind of role again, especially if concerns about nuclear escalation pop up again. The fundamental dynamics haven't really changed.
Okay, so let's try and recap. This reported U.S. role in facilitating the ceasefire, initially surprising given some rhetoric, seems to have been driven by these deep worries about escalation, especially the nuclear kind.
Right.
And it was likely made possible by a mix of things: proactive diplomacy from key U.S. figures, maybe some trade leverage, and the fact that both India and Pakistan might have reached a point where they could de-escalate without losing face.
That sums it up well. It's a complex situation, but that interplay of factors seems to have created the conditions for the U.S. to step in, even after those earlier signals suggested maybe a different approach.
And for you, our listener, especially if you're focused on understanding these crucial current events, perhaps for the UPSC exams, or just to be generally well-informed, this deep dive into the real intricacies of international relations and security dynamics offers really valuable context. It highlights that delicate balance of power in South Asia and the evolving role of outside actors like the U.S. It's a really important case study, actually, for understanding how geopolitics and nuclear worries shape foreign policy.
Indeed, and it raises a significant question for you to consider. Given the long history here, the complexity, the potential for future crises, what does this reported U.S. involvement signal about the changing role of external powers in South Asian security?
Yeah, that's a big one.
And how should India, in particular, navigate this evolving dynamic going forward? It's a really complex interplay of regional tensions and global power shifts that needs careful thought.
Absolutely. Some really crucial points to mull over there. If you found this in-depth analysis helpful in understanding this important topic, please do consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into significant current events.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Definitely share your thoughts or any further questions you might have in the comments below. We really appreciate your engagement. And just a final reminder, the source for our discussion today was the Indian Express.